A young mother and her 6-month-old baby disappeared from Everglades National Park, triggering a desperate search. When search teams came up empty-handed, investigators were forced to a grim conclusion. They had been lost to the swamp's top predators. The case went cold for a year, an official record with no final chapter. That chapter was finally written when hunters captured a python with a stomach so unnaturally swollen it was hard to believe. The horrifying truth it held was far worse than any alligator attack. Music. The asphalt parking lot near the entrance of Everglades National Park still radiated the day's stored heat, even as the Florida sun dipped below the horizon of sawgrass. It was Saturday, June 14, 2014. Era Connolly leaned against the warm hood of her car. The thick, humid air was filled with the rising chorus of cicadas and the distant, guttural bellows of alligators beginning their nightly routines. She checked her phone again. 8:15 p.m. The screen lit up her face, highlighting the deepening lines of worry around her eyes. Her daughter, 28-year-old Roshene Kalin, and her 6-month-old grandson, Tieran, were supposed to have met her here over an hour ago. The huge parking area, which had been buzzing with tourists, families, and airboat operators just a few hours earlier, was now almost deserted. A few park ranger vehicles were parked near the entrance station, but otherwise, Era was alone. She dialed Roshene's number for the 6th time in 30 minutes. It went straight to voicemail. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, a feeling separate from the oppressive humidity. Roshene was dependable. She was organized, meticulous in her planning, especially when it came to Tieran. She wouldn't just forget the pickup time or let her phone battery die without warning. Era scrolled through her photos, her thumb pausing on an image she had taken that very morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. Roshene had looked so happy, standing next to the large gray boulder that held the official Everglades National Park sign. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress with green flowers, and a wide-brimmed straw hat shielded her pale skin from the harsh sun. Dark sunglasses hid her eyes, but her smile was wide and genuine. Strapped securely to her chest in a soft blue fabric carrier was Tieran, beaming a wide, toothless grin at his grandmother. It was the picture of a perfect day out. Now, as the last bit of twilight faded and the darkness seemed to amplify the wild sounds of the swamp, the image felt haunting. Era pushed off the car and walked quickly toward the ranger station, the gravel crunching under her feet. Inside, the air conditioning was a sharp contrast to the heavy heat outside. She found a park ranger, Officer Davies, finishing up the day's log. Era explained the situation, her voice trembling slightly as she shared the details. Roshene, 28, Tieran, 6 months. They were supposed to be hiking the easy, accessible trails, nothing too hard. They had planned to spend the whole day there, a much-needed break from the stress of Roshene's life. As the ranger began making the necessary calls, the context of Roshene's situation became clear. She was a widow. Her husband had died unexpectedly less than a year earlier, leaving Roshene to navigate new motherhood alone and with little money. The life insurance payment was small, forcing Roshene to go back to part-time nursing shifts sooner than she had expected. She was exhausted, juggling the demands of the hospital with the sleepless nights of an infant. But she was fiercely independent. She rarely accepted financial help from Era, determined to provide for Tieran herself. This trip to the Everglades was meant to be a reset, a breath of fresh air after a difficult week. Era had dropped them off at 10 a.m. Roshene had insisted on exploring alone. She wanted quiet time with her son. They had packed enough supplies, water, snacks, diapers, a small first aid kit. Roshene respected the wilderness. She wasn't reckless. Officer Davies's attitude shifted from polite concern to urgent professionalism. The Everglades was not just a park. It was a vast, unforgiving wilderness spanning 1.5 million acres of wetlands. The dangers were many: dehydration, getting lost, alligators, venomous snakes. A lone woman with an infant was incredibly vulnerable. By 10 p.m., the entrance area was lit up by the flashing lights of the local police department. An official missing persons report was filed. As the thick darkness of the Florida night settled over the swamp, the search for Roshene and Tieran Kalin began. The urgency was immediate. Every hour that passed decreased the chances of a good outcome. The wilderness that had promised a day of peace now held a terrifying unknown. Dawn broke over the Everglades on Sunday morning. The rising sun cut through the thick, humid air, promising another day of brutal heat. The search operation, which had mobilized overnight, was massive. The disappearance of a mother and infant triggered a multi-agency response that turned the park in trance into a busy, organized command center. Local police, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, and National Park Service rangers coordinated their efforts. The air was thick with the sound of radio chatter, the roar of airboat engines, and the rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades. The initial strategy was simple: focus on the areas Roshene was most likely to have visited. Era Connolly, pale and sleepless, told investigators about Roshene's planned route. She intended to stick to the well-maintained boardwalk trails near the main entrance. These were popular areas, with lots of tourists. It seemed impossible that someone could vanish from there without being seen, without leaving a trace. Airboats were sent to scan the waterways in the vast fields of sawgrass, their massive fans roaring as they skimmed the surface of the shallow water. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew low in grids over the dense clusters of trees, their sensors searching for any sign of human presence beneath the canopy. On the ground, teams of rangers, police officers, and experienced volunteers began walking the trails, calling Roshene's name, their voices swallowed by the immense landscape. The K9 units brought in to track Roshene's scent from the parking lot struggled with the overwhelming sensory input of the swamp and the sheer number of people who had passed through the area over the weekend. While the physical search ramped up, detectives began the routine background investigation into Roshene Kalin's life. They needed to understand who she was, and if there was any underlying reason she might have chosen to disappear, or if someone might have had a reason to harm her. The picture that emerged was one of quiet strength and heartbreaking normalcy. Roshene was a devoted mother, and her colleagues at the hospital universally liked her. Her financial struggles were clear from her bank statements. The strain of managing on a single part-time income was obvious. But she was managing. There were no signs of depression, no secret relationships, no significant debts to dangerous people, no enemies. She was simply a young widow trying to build a life for her son. The technical part of the investigation provided little more than a confirmation of the timeline. Roshene's cell phone records were pulled. Her phone had last pinged a tower near the park entrance shortly after Era dropped her off on Saturday morning. After that, the digital trail vanished. It suggested the phone was either turned off, destroyed, or had moved out of range deep within the park very early in the day. The first 48 hours were critical, and the search teams pushed themselves to the limit. They found tourist litter, stray water bottles, discarded wrappers, even a lost child's shoe, but nothing belonging to Roshene or Tieran. The heat was relentless, the humidity suffocating. The searchers battled dehydration and exhaustion, driven by the urgency of finding the missing mother and baby. It was on the third day of the search, Tuesday, June 17th, that the operation ran into an unexpected and significant problem, one that would completely change the course of the immediate efforts. The command center was preparing to expand the search grid into the less popular, more rugged trails and service roads that branched deeper into the park. These were areas Roshene was less likely to have gone, but with the main trails yielding nothing, they had to be checked. It was the logical next step in a thorough search pattern. Detective Jasper Mallory, a seasoned officer serving as the local police liaison for the interagency coordination, arrived at the command briefing with urgent news. Mallory was known for his practical, sometimes bureaucratic, approach to police work. He addressed the search coordinators with a tone of serious concern. He informed them that a significant section of the planned expansion area, specifically several key access roads and the surrounding trails, was indefinitely closed, effective immediately. The reason, Mallory explained, was an environmental hazard. According to a report filed late Monday night, a private agricultural contractor working on land bordering the park had experienced a catastrophic equipment failure during a routine pesticide application. This failure resulted in the accidental overspray of a strong, restricted chemical into the park's boundaries. The chemical, he detailed, citing the report, was dangerous if inhaled or touched before it broke down. The implications for the search effort were immediate and devastating. The contaminated zone included a large area directly next to where Roshene might have wandered if she had become disoriented or looked for a less crowded path. Because of the environmental hazard, ground teams and K9 units were strictly forbidden from entering the zone. The risk of exposure to the searchers, Mallory stressed, citing state and federal environmental regulations, was too great. The liability for the agencies involved was immense. The decision caused immediate frustration among the experienced park rangers and volunteer search leaders. They argued that they had special equipment to handle hazardous materials, and that the risk was worth taking given the vulnerability of the missing infant, who had now been exposed to the elements for 3 days. They pleaded for an exception or a compromise that would allow them to search the area safely. But Detective Mallory was firm. The regulations were clear. The zone was closed until environmental specialists could assess the risk and clear the area, a process that could take days, maybe even a week. Furthermore, Mallory emphasized the dangers of the deep swamp, the areas far beyond the contamination zone. He suggested that Roshene, perhaps seeking shade or getting disoriented, had likely wandered much farther off the main paths than anyone initially believed. He pointed to the vast, inaccessible wilderness to the west, suggesting that was the most probable location given the lack of evidence in the accessible areas. The search was effectively rerouted. Resources were poured into the deep swamp areas that required airboats and specialized equipment, areas where the chances of survival were slim. The air search continued over the contamination zone, but the dense canopy of cypress and mangrove trees made thermal imaging difficult and visual spotting nearly impossible. The most critical tool, careful ground searching, had been removed from a key area of interest. The days turned into a week. The media attention, initially intense, began to fade as the story stalled. The command center grew quieter. The army of volunteers dwindled. Despite the massive effort involving hundreds of people and thousands of hours, not a single trace of Roshene or Tieran had been found. No diaper bag, no piece of the yellow dress, no baby carrier. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the humid air. Era Connolly refused to accept the story that was being formed. She knew Roshene. Her daughter would not have wandered recklessly into the deep swamp with her baby. The complete lack of any physical evidence felt wrong. It wasn't just that they hadn't found Roshene and Tieran, it was that they hadn't found anything at all. After 2 weeks, the active search was officially scaled back. The resources were needed elsewhere. The prevailing theory, the one documented in the reports and supported by the assessments presented during the briefings, was a tragic accident. Roshene and Tieran had died from the elements or from wildlife deep within the Everglades. Their remains, investigators believed, were likely scattered by scavengers or submerged in the murky waters, lost forever to the swamp. Era protested, begging the authorities to keep looking, particularly in the areas they hadn't thoroughly searched on foot due to the contamination zone restrictions. But the investigation had hit a wall. The case files were organized, the reports finalized, and the disappearance of Roshene and Roshene Kalin began its slow journey into the archives of cold cases. A year passed. The silence from the Everglades remained absolute. The case of Roshene and Roshene Kalin had gone completely cold. The initial flurry of activity, the massive search, the media attention, had all faded, leaving behind only the agonizing emptiness. For Era Connolly, the year had been a blur of grief and frustration. She never accepted the official conclusion that her daughter and grandson were simply lost to the swamp. She continued to pressure the authorities, hired private investigators, and handed out flyers, but every lead ended in a dead end. The lack of any physical evidence remained the central, baffling mystery. The Everglades, meanwhile, continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human tragedy that had unfolded within its boundaries. But the ecosystem was under attack. An invasive species, the Burmese python, had established a destructive foothold, wiping out local wildlife populations. In response, the state of Florida had authorized programs encouraging hobbyist hunters to track and remove these giant snakes, offering rewards and organizing hunts to control the population explosion. It was June 2015. Wyatt Jones and Gareth Brody, 2 experienced python hunters, were deep in a remote, grassy expanse of the Everglades, miles from the nearest road or tourist trail. They had been out since dawn, navigating the difficult terrain in their customized swamp buggy, scanning the dense vegetation for the distinctive pattern of a python's skin. The area was known for large snakes, and the conditions were perfect. Hot, humid, the air still after a recent rain. The vast field of dry, tall grass stretched out before them, taking on a strange, almost purplish-pink hue under the overcast sky. As the late afternoon light began to fade, Gareth spotted it, a massive Burmese python resting on a large, flat gray rock, partially hidden by the grass. It was one of the largest they had ever seen, likely over 16 feet long. But its length wasn't what first caught their attention. It was the incredible girth. The snake's thick, muscular body was coiled passively, its distinctive dark brown and black patches patterned over a dull tan base. A massive, elongated bulge stretched the skin tautly in the center of its body, an unnatural shape that clearly indicated it had recently consumed a very large meal. Wyatt slowed their buggy to a stop and cut the engine. The only sound was the buzzing of insects as the two men watched the snake. In the Everglades, a bulge that size usually meant one thing: a large deer, a wild hog, or maybe an alligator. It was a significant find, both for the bounty program and for removing such a huge predator from the ecosystem. They acted quickly and efficiently. Gareth raised his specialized shotgun, loaded with heavy shot designed for large reptiles, and fired a single shot that killed the snake instantly. As they approached the carcass, its sheer size was even more impressive up close. The immense, solid bulge stretched the snake's body to an unnatural dimension. They estimated the snake and its meal weighed over 200 pounds. It took considerable effort for both men to strain against the dead weight and haul the massive carcass onto the back of their swamp buggy. After securing it with heavy straps, they began the long, jarring ride back to civilization. Their destination was an official FWC check-in station where the snake would be measured, weighed, and documented for the python removal program. The sun was setting as they arrived at the small outpost. The FWC officer on duty, a young biologist named Ben Carter, was impressed by the python's size. He helped them unload the carcass onto a large stainless steel necropsy table. The official measurements were taken: 16 feet, 4 inches, and 218 pounds. As Officer Carter recorded the data, Wyatt and Gareth's curiosity got the better of them. It was standard procedure to examine a python's stomach contents, as it provided valuable data on the snake's diet and its impact on the ecosystem. Given the size of the bulge, they were convinced it had consumed a mature white-tailed deer. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed as Wyatt took a large, sharp knife and prepared to make the incision. The atmosphere was casual, the men joking about the size of the antlers they might find. Wyatt pierced the snake's taut belly skin, making a long, clean cut along the length of the bulge. The hide was thick and required significant pressure to cut through. When the stomach cavity opened, the smell was immediate and overwhelming. A powerful stench of advanced decomposition mixed with the musky, acidic scent of the snake's digestive fluids. It was stronger than usual, but not entirely unexpected given the size of the meal. They peeled back the layers of skin and muscle tissue. The stomach lining was stretched thin, even translucent in some places. Wyatt made the final incision, opening the stomach itself. At first, the contents were a difficult-to-discern mass of partially digested tissue and bone. A python's digestive process is incredibly powerful, breaking down large animals relatively quickly. Wearing heavy rubber gloves, Gareth reached in, trying to identify the prey. He pulled at something large and heavy lodged in the center of the mass. "Must be the haunch of the deer," Wyatt mumbled, leaning in closer. Gareth struggled with the weight, repositioning his grip. He pulled harder, and the object shifted, emerging from the grotesque mass. Then they saw it. It wasn't fur. It wasn't the hide of a deer. It was pale, smooth skin. Gareth recoiled, stumbling backward, his face draining of color. He gagged as the smell suddenly became unbearable. Wyatt froze, the knife still in his hand, staring at the contents of the snake's stomach. Exposed in the bright light was an entire human leg, severed at the hip. The toes were visible, the skin slick and discolored, but undeniably human. The realization hit them all simultaneously. This wasn't an animal. The python had consumed a human. The experienced hunters, accustomed to the grim realities of the wilderness, were profoundly shaken. The casual atmosphere of the check-in station shattered. Officer Carter, seeing the object, stepped closer to the table, and the horror instantly registered on his face. He immediately reached for his radio, his voice tight with urgency. "Dispatch, this is Everglades Station 7. We have a situation. We need homicide detectives and the me out here immediately. We have human remains found inside a python." The check station, usually a place of routine data collection, was immediately transformed into a crime scene. The area was cordoned off, and investigators arrived quickly, the gravity of the situation evident in their demeanor. The necropsy continued under the direction of the medical examiner. The process was meticulous and gruesome. Inside the python's digestive tract, they recovered not only the leg but other significant body parts, a partial torso and an arm. The remains were severely degraded by the snake's powerful digestive enzymes, but they were unmistakably human and appeared to belong to an adult. The discovery was shocking, unprecedented even in the Everglades, a place often associated with strange and macabre occurrences. The immediate questions were overwhelming. Who is this person? How did they end up inside a Burmese python? The initial theories were speculative. While a large python could potentially kill an adult human, it was extremely rare. It seemed far more likely that the snake had scavenged the remains. But the remains were dismembered, and pythons do not tear their prey apart. This suggested that something else had happened to the body before the snake found it. Investigators considered the possibility of a murder, with the Everglades being a notorious dumping ground for bodies. The remains were carefully collected and transported to the medical examiner's office for analysis. The priority was identification. DNA testing was the only option. The DNA profile was extracted from the recovered bone marrow and entered into the National Missing Persons Database, CODIS. Days later, the match came back. The remains found inside the 16-foot Burmese python belonged to Roshene Kalin. The news hit Connolly like a physical blow. After a year of agonizing uncertainty, the fate of her daughter had been revealed in the most horrific way imaginable. The discovery confirmed Roshene's death, but offered no closure. Instead, it ripped the case wide open, plunging the investigation into a new realm of terrifying possibilities. And it raised a critical, agonizing question. Where was Tieran? The discovery of Roshene Kalin's remains galvanized the investigation. The case, dormant for nearly a year, was immediately reopened and assigned to a specialized team of detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. The horrific nature of the discovery brought renewed media attention and immense pressure to find answers. But the confirmation of Roshene's death only deepened the central mystery. Critically, within the python, amidst the partially digested remains of the adult female, there were no remains, no clothing fragments, no trace whatsoever of 6-month-old Tieran. The investigation faced a complex puzzle, a gruesome equation with too many unknown variables. How did Roshene die? How was her body dismembered? And what happened to the baby? The first priority was to understand the interaction between the python and the remains. The medical examiner, Dr. Evelyn Reed, conducted a detailed analysis of the recovered body parts. The examination confirmed the initial assessment made at the scene. The python had scavenged the remains. It did not kill Roshene. There were no signs of constriction trauma, no crushed bones or widespread bruising consistent with a python attack. The dismemberment, the separation of the limbs from the torso, had occurred before the snake consumed the parts. This led to the prevailing hypothesis among the investigators, the scavenger theory. They hypothesized that Roshene had died in the park a year prior, perhaps from exposure or an accident, as initially believed. Her body, they speculated, had been dismembered by the true apex predator of the Everglades, the alligator. Alligators are known to tear their prey apart using a violent death roll, often stashing the parts underwater to decompose before consumption. The python, an opportunistic feeder, must have found these scavenged parts and consumed them. This theory seemed plausible, fitting the brutal realities of the Everglades ecosystem. It explained the dismemberment and the python's involvement and aligned with the initial assumption that Roshene had died in the park. However, there were significant inconsistencies that troubled the lead detectives. The location where the python was found was analyzed. It was deep within the park and remote, but it was primarily a grassy expanse, not the deep water habitats typically favored by large alligators for stashing prey. Furthermore, the trauma at the points of dismemberment, while severely degraded by the python's powerful digestive fluids, did not seem entirely consistent with the typical tearing action of an alligator attack. The edges of the bone, where discernible, seemed cleaner, more precise than expected from a death roll. Despite these inconsistencies, the scavenger theory remained the leading hypothesis. The alternative, that a human had dismembered the body, seemed too horrific to contemplate without further evidence. The investigation focused on trying to locate the rest of Roshene's remains and any sign of Tieran. Search teams were redeployed to the area where the python was found, conducting meticulous grid searches and dredging nearby waterways, looking for any trace of the infant's clothing, the baby carrier, anything that might provide a clue as to what happened that day. The search yielded nothing. The swamp remained silent, offering no further clues. The mystery of Tieran's fate became the agonizing focus of the investigation. If Roshene had died in an accident, Tieran would have been with her. His remains should have been nearby. The absence of any trace suggested a terrifying alternative, that someone else was involved in their disappearance and that Tieran had been separated from his mother. It was at this point that the investigation brought in a specialist, Dr. Aries Thorne, a forensic anthropologist renowned for his expertise in analyzing severely degraded remains and the taphonomy of decomposition. Dr. Thorne's task was to determine the timeline of events, the environment the body had been exposed to, and the nature of the dismemberment. The examination was conducted at the State Forensic Laboratory. The remains were carefully cleaned and prepared for analysis. Dr. Thorne spent days meticulously examining the tissue, the bone structure, and the cellular degradation. He analyzed the patterns of digestion, the effects of the python's enzymes on the remains, comparing them to known samples of decomposition in the Everglades. He noted that the state of the remains, while degraded by the python, seemed inconsistent with a year of exposure in the humid, biologically active environment of the swamp. The tissue preservation was better than expected. This observation further weakened the scavenger theory. It was during the microscopic examination of the muscle tissue that Dr. Thorne discovered the anomaly, a finding so unexpected that it would shatter the prevailing theories and alter the course of the investigation entirely. He was analyzing thin slices of the tissue under a high-powered microscope. Examining the cellular structure, he noticed a specific pattern of damage that was completely out of place. The cell walls were ruptured in a distinct way inconsistent with normal decomposition, freezing temperatures in the wild, or the effects of the python's digestive fluids. He recognized the pattern immediately, though he had rarely seen it in a forensic context involving remains found in a subtropical environment. It was the signature of ice crystal formation artifacts. When biological tissue is frozen, particularly when frozen rapidly and kept at a consistently low temperature, the water inside the cells expands, forming sharp ice crystals that puncture the cell membranes. When the tissue is subsequently thawed, the structural integrity of the cells is compromised, leaving behind these distinct microscopic markers. Dr. Thorne conducted further tests, taking samples from multiple locations on the recovered remains. He confirmed his initial observation. The cellular damage was widespread, consistent throughout the tissue. The conclusion was unmistakable. Roshene Kalin's body had been frozen solid, likely in a commercial-grade freezer for an extended period, and subsequently thawed before being consumed by the python. The revelation was a forensic bombshell. It instantly invalidated the scavenger theory. Roshene had not died in the Everglades a year ago and decomposed naturally. The timeline of the investigation was completely wrong. The implications were staggering. Roshene Kalin was murdered. Her body was preserved, stored in a freezer for months, perhaps nearly the entire year since her disappearance. Then, relatively recently, likely just days before the python found her, her body was removed from the freezer, dismembered, and disposed of in the Everglades. The discovery explained the inconsistencies in the scavenger theory, the relatively good preservation of the tissue, and the clean cuts on the bone. It all pointed to human intervention. The dismemberment was not the work of alligators. It was done by human hands, likely to facilitate the disposal of the body and increase the chances of it being consumed by scavengers. The python's involvement was not the central element of the crime. It was a random, bizarre accident that revealed the crime. The investigation shifted dramatically. This was not a tragic accident. It was a complex, calculated homicide. The level of sophistication required to store a body for a year suggested a perpetrator with resources, planning, and a chilling lack of empathy. The discovery also gave terrifying weight to the possibility that Tieran had been abducted. If Roshene was murdered, the perpetrator would have had to deal with the infant. The absence of Tieran's remains suggested he might still be alive, taken by the person or persons responsible for his mother's death. The investigation now faced a new set of urgent questions. Who had the motive and the resources to commit such a heinous crime? Where was the freezer used to store Roshene's body? And most importantly, where was Tieran? The case, once thought to be a tragic mystery of the swamp, now revealed a darkness far more calculated and sinister than anyone had imagined. The pursuit of a killer and a missing child began in earnest. The shocking discovery that Roshene Kalin's body had been frozen for nearly a year transformed a local mystery into a massive, complex homicide case. The primary obstacle was the time gap. The crime had occurred a year earlier, but the evidence was only just surfacing. The trail was intentionally frozen by a cunning killer. The investigation centered on the logistical requirements of the crime. Storing a human body for a year would require a large, likely commercial-grade freezer, significant energy consumption, and a secure private location. Investigators began the grueling task of analyzing energy consumption records across the surrounding counties, searching for unusual spikes that might indicate a continuously running freezer. They cross-referenced this data with purchase records for commercial freezers from the months before and after Roshene's disappearance, checking locations like hunting lodges, meat processing facilities, and secluded properties near the Everglades. The sheer volume of data was immense, making the task daunting. The analysis produced hundreds of potential leads, each requiring a slow, meticulous process of interviews, surveillance, and background checks. Weeks stretched into months, but despite the intense effort, the data yielded no immediate suspects. The perpetrator had successfully concealed their crime in plain sight, leaving no discernible trace of the storage location. The investigation once again stalled. The initial shock of the Python discovery and the forensic breakthrough faded, and the case began to drift back toward the cold case archives. The complexity of the crime and the lack of physical evidence from the original scene made progress nearly impossible. Then, in 2016, almost 2 years after Roshene's disappearance, a fresh perspective was brought to the case. Detective Elena Ruiz, a meticulous investigator from the Cold Case Unit, began a comprehensive review of the entire case file. Ruiz was motivated by the fact that the freezing evidence proved the initial 2014 theory, that Roshene had died in the swamp, was critically wrong. Ruiz decided to re-examine the initial search effort from the ground up, looking for anything that might explain how the crime scene was missed or overlooked. Ruiz spent weeks immersed in the 2014 files, analyzing search coordination logs, deployment maps, witness statements, and communication records from the command center. She focused on the decisions made during the critical first days, when the trail was freshest. It was during this review that she discovered the contamination zone. Reports detailed the closure of a significant section of the park due to an accidental pesticide spill, which had diverted ground teams away from key areas near Roshene's last known location. At the time, it was treated as an unfortunate bureaucratic hurdle, but in light of the new evidence, the timing and location of the spill seemed suspiciously convenient. It had effectively shut down the search in a critical area during the most crucial window of the investigation. Ruiz decided to verify the incident report for the chemical spill as a matter of due diligence. She first contacted the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, requesting records of the reported pesticide overspray in June 2014. A spill of a restricted pesticide would generate a significant paper trail involving mandatory reporting and cleanup protocols. The EPA's response was startling. There was no record of any such incident in the Everglades or the surrounding areas during that time. Puzzled, Ruiz contacted state agricultural agencies, which also found no record. She then attempted to contact the private agricultural contractor named in the police report, only to discover the company didn't exist. The conclusion was chilling and undeniable. The chemical spill was a complete fabrication. The contamination zone was a lie, a ghost story invented to obstruct the search for Roshene and Tieran. The implications were profound. Someone with authority, someone inside the investigation, had intentionally sabotaged the search from the very beginning. The focus immediately shifted to the officer who authorized the closure of the zone, Detective Jasper Mallory. Mallory, the police liaison during the initial search, had reported the spill and enforced the closure. He had actively steered the investigation away from the restricted area, promoting the theory that Roshene had wandered deep into the swamp, making him the architect of the misdirection. Detective Ruiz presented her findings to Internal Affairs. The realization that a police officer might be involved in the cover-up of a murder and kidnapping was explosive. Mallory was immediately placed under investigation. A deep financial audit was initiated, and investigators began discreetly monitoring his activities, communications, and movements to understand the extent of the corruption and, more importantly, who Mallory was working for. Mallory, a veteran detective with years of experience, sensed the scrutiny, the sudden coldness from his colleagues, the restricted access to case files, the feeling of being watched. He knew the fabricated chemical spill was being uncovered. The realization triggered a desperate, panicked response. Late one night, long after the precinct had emptied, Mallory made a critical mistake. He used his authorization code to access the department's archival server room in the basement, which housed the digital records of past investigations, including the detailed coordination logs and communications from the 2014 search. Mallory believed he could physically destroy the servers, erasing the digital trail of his actions. If the data were gone, the evidence against him would be circumstantial. He entered the climate-controlled room, the air cold and silent except for the whirring fans and humming servers. He located the specific server rack containing the 2014 data and began to forcibly dismantle the hardware. His hands, slick with sweat, struggled to pull out the hard drives, the sound of wrenching metal echoing in the quiet room. What he didn't know was that internal affairs investigators, anticipating such a move, had placed the server room under surveillance. They were watching him on security cameras, recording his desperate attempt to destroy evidence. As Mallory struggled, the door burst open, and internal affairs investigators flooded the room, their weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the dim light. "Detective Mallory, step away from the server." Mallory spun around, his face pale with shock and fear, the hard drive clattering to the floor. He was caught in the act. The confrontation was tense and brief. Mallory, cornered and exposed, offered no resistance. He was arrested, suspended from duty, and the investigation escalated from an internal review to a criminal probe. The exposure of the fabricated chemical spill and Mallory's desperate attempt to destroy evidence confirmed a conspiracy existed. The investigation now had a clear target, but the question remained: who was pulling the strings? The arrest of Detective Jasper Mallory sent shockwaves through the department and the local community. The evidence of his corruption was undeniable, but the motivation remained the central question. Fabricating a chemical spill to obstruct a missing persons investigation, especially one involving an infant, suggested a powerful external influence, someone willing to pay a high price to keep the truth hidden. The investigation moved quickly, with the rescue of Tieran as the top priority. The first target was Detective Mallory, who was already in custody. Now armed with irrefutable evidence of the bribery and the connection to the human trafficking ring, investigators confronted Mallory with the full weight of the case. They presented him with the Interpol data, the wire transfers, and the undeniable proof that his actions had facilitated the trafficking of a child. The interrogation was intense. Mallory, facing the prospect of federal charges for human trafficking and potentially accessory to murder, realized the extent of his predicament. The weight of his complicity finally broke him. Prosecutors offered him a narrow window for cooperation, and Mallory confessed. He admitted that Orion Vance had paid him to fabricate the chemical spill story to keep searchers away from a specific area of the Everglades, a remote access road near the Vance family's land where the crime had occurred. Mallory claimed he didn't know the full details of the crime, only that Vance needed the area secured and the investigation steered away from his family. He provided the details of their arrangement, the communication protocols, and the payment schedule, giving them everything they needed to move against the Vances. Mallory's confession provided the final piece of the puzzle, the direct testimony needed to secure search warrants for the Vance estate. The operation was planned meticulously. The estate was sprawling and heavily secured, and the risk of confrontation was high. A coordinated, high-stakes SWAT operation involving federal agents, state police, and the local SWAT team was authorized to arrest Orion and his son, Cameron. At dawn, a convoy of armored vehicles supported by helicopters descended on the estate. They breached the gates and secured the perimeter, moving rapidly toward the main villa. The silence of the early morning was shattered by the roar of engines, the chopping of helicopter blades, and the shouts of the SWAT team. The team assigned to the main villa moved quickly, breaching the entrance with a controlled explosion. They found Orion Vance in his study, seemingly preparing for his day, and arrested him without incident. Simultaneously, another team moved to secure Cameron in the guest house. But as the police vehicles approached, Cameron heard the commotion. He looked out the window, saw the flashing lights, and panicked. Cameron bolted from the guest house, jumping into a high-powered off-road vehicle and tearing across the property toward the dense wilderness of the Everglades. The chase was immediate and tense. Cameron drove recklessly, but the coordinated effort of the ground teams and air support was too much. They managed to corner him, cutting off his escape route near a deep canal. Realizing he was trapped, Cameron abandoned the vehicle and attempted to flee on foot, but was apprehended after a brief struggle. With both Orion and Cameron Vance in custody, the investigation focused on searching the estate to locate evidence of the murder, specifically the freezer used to store Roshene's body. It was in the basement of the main villa that they found it. Concealed behind a false wall in a large storage area was a commercial-grade walk-in freezer. It was empty and recently cleaned, but forensic teams knew that cleaning it would not erase all traces of evidence. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts with blood, they sprayed the interior, which glowed faintly, indicating the presence of blood that had been cleaned. Critical evidence was found in the hidden areas where cleaning would be difficult, such as the rubber seals around the door and the drainage system. They collected samples, and the results were positive. They found trace evidence of Roshene Kalin's blood and DNA preserved within the seals and drainage system. The discovery was the final, irrefutable proof, linking the Van Cest directly to the murder and the elaborate cover-up. The chain of evidence was complete. Orion and Cameron Vance were interrogated separately. The overwhelming evidence, the financial records, Mallory's confession, and the DNA evidence from the freezer, was insurmountable. Under the intense pressure of interrogation, Cameron broke down. The fear and guilt he had suppressed for nearly 3 years finally surfaced. He confessed to his role in the crime, the details spilling out in a torrent of panicked words. Cameron admitted that on June 14, 2014, he was driving his truck while intoxicated and illegally hunting alligators when he struck Roshene, who was holding her baby. The impact was brutal, knocking her unconscious. Cameron, terrified of a potential DUI manslaughter charge that would destroy his future, called his father. Orion arrived quickly and in a cold, calculated decision to protect his son, loaded the unconscious Roshene and the crying Tieran into his truck. He drove them back to the estate, where he murdered Roshene to ensure her silence and placed her body in the walk-in freezer. He then contacted Detective Mallory, promising a substantial payment to fabricate the chemical spill and steer the investigation away from the crime scene. The baby Tieran presented a different problem. Orion couldn't kill the infant, so he used his criminal connections to contact Gregor Azov's human trafficking organization and arranged for Tieran to be handed over, paying a substantial fee for the illicit adoption. Roshene's body remained in the freezer for a year. When the case went cold, Orion removed the body, dismembered it to facilitate disposal, and dumped the parts deep in the Everglades, hoping scavengers would erase the evidence. He never anticipated that a Burmese python would consume the remains and reveal the truth. The confessions were detailed and chilling. The crime was not premeditated murder, but a series of calculated, ruthless decisions driven by a desperate attempt to protect wealth and privilege. With the confession secured and the evidence compiled, the focus shifted to rescuing Tieran. Utilizing the information from the seized servers and the Van Cest confessions, Interpol tracked the smuggling route and identified the adoptive family in Eastern Europe, who were unaware of the horrific circumstances of the adoption. The process was delicate, involving international diplomacy and legal negotiations. After weeks of coordination, authorities located Tieran, now 3 years old, healthy and safe. Era Connolly immediately traveled to Eastern Europe. After nearly 3 years of agonizing grief, she was finally going to see her grandson. The reunion took place at a government facility. Era waited in a quiet room, her heart pounding. The door opened, and a social worker walked in holding the hand of a small boy. The moment Era saw Tieran, the resemblance to Roshene was unmistakable. The years of grief lifted, and she knelt down, tears streaming down her face, and opened her arms. Orion and Cameron Vance were charged with murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, and obstruction of justice. They both received lengthy prison sentences, their wealth and influence unable to shield them from the consequences of their crimes. Jasper Mallory was convicted and imprisoned for his role in the conspiracy. Era Connolly gained full custody of Tieran, returning to Florida to begin a new life, honoring Roshene's memory by providing Tieran with the love and security his mother had fought so hard to give him.